Jungle.
Good morning, welcome to the Morning Momentum this beautiful Thursday. This is a daily compendium of local and international news, human interest stories, current affairs, and expert opinion. Ladies and gentlemen, gear up for today's section of the newspaper review, and we are going to start with the Standard newspaper. Before we do that, make sure you interact with us via our socials at Younib_TV on Instagram, Younib Media TV on Facebook and YouTube. Use the hashtag The Morning Momentum. Let's delve into the top stories this morning on the Standard newspaper. The elephant in the room. Round 2 talks fly into headwinds. After the first round of bipartisan talks between Kenya Kwanza and Azimio la Umoja failed spectacularly at its infancy, a fresh push for dialogue has started in an environment of fear and thinly veiled hostility among rival parties, even as Kenya Kwanza released its first list of negotiators. We'll take a look at that story on page 6 of the Standard this morning. Also, WorldCoin operations suspended. Most of that story is beefed up for you on page 8 of the Standard this morning. On page 12, blow to state as court freezes logging order. We'll take a look at that story on page 12. On page 5, Kenya on track to meet demand for maize. That story is beefed up for you on page 5. Also, why banks are KRA's cash cow. We'll take a look at that story under business news on page 18. Now, also revealed big loans burden for graduates. That story is beefed up for you on page 4. Let's now take a look at the stories inside the Standard this morning, and we start with page 3. Woman dumps lover after husband returns years later. She chased away Rwandese man she has lived with for 4 years. The first husband left home some 17 years ago and entered homestead. That story is beefed up for you on page 3. Also, witness says slain activist, key suspect, had a relationship. The High Court in Eldoret has been told that slain LGBTQ activist Edwin Kipto alias Chiloba was in a relationship with the key murder suspect. You can catch up with that story on page 3 of the Standard this morning. On page 4, how the new funding formula will make varsity loans more expensive. Heavy loans burden for new university graduates looming. Students pursuing same courses to pay different amounts. That story is beefed up for you on page 4. On page 5, President predicts surplus maize harvest. Ruto says price of fertilizer to drop from 2,500 to drop to 2,500. To increase farmers' production. Government has increased the budget for AFC from 2 billion shillings to 10 billion Kenya shillings. That story is beefed up for you on page 5 of the Standard this morning. On page 6, Kenya Kwanza unveils team amid jitters over cost of living as agenda. Ichungwa accuses Azimio of failure to abide by 5 issues agreed on. Azimio says high cost of living must be prioritized, but Kenya Kwanza doesn't think so. That story is beefed up for you on page 6 of the Standard this morning. On page 7, MPs now threaten to end one-sided space center deal with Italy. National Assembly Committee claims the center only benefits Italy and its Western partner agencies. Defense CS Duale says he advised Deputy President not to meet Italian officials who wanted the deal extended. That story is beefed up for you on page 7 of the Standard this morning. On page 8, CS Kindiki suspends controversial WorldCoin amid probe on others. For 4 days, the firm has been dishing out 7,000 to citizens having their iris scanned. Government says it is probing any breach of data privacy in the process. You can catch up with that story on page 8 of the Standard this morning. Let's move on to page 10. 2 unborn babies raise Shakahola deaths to 427. Government pathologist says 2 pregnant women were among the cult victims. Relatives to wait longer before burial results of DNA tests are not yet ready. That story is beefed up for you on page 10. Let's move on to page 12. Blow to Ruto. Millers as court returns logging ban. The president lifted 2018 moratorium meant to restore the country's forest cover. Law Society of Kenya says Ruto's roadside directive illegal and a danger to environment. That story is beefed up for you on page 12. On page 13, CS admits jobs agency in scam is not registered with her ministry. CS offers to mediate between the accused agency and the youth, but human rights activists rejects the offer, saying the youth just want their money back. You can catch up with that story on page 13 of the Standard. Let's take a look at some expert opinion. Now, beyond words, talks should be about electoral justice, not the cost of living. Now, this is Elias Mokua. Tell me, why should the high cost of living in Kenya today be a major agenda for the dialogue meant to end political turbulence that we have experienced in the past 3 months? You can catch up with that story on page 14. On page 15, was it in order for President to lock out late CSS? Culture lethargy must end. That is a sentiment by Malvin Mwamba. Now, on the contrary, Mary Wavinya says no, that was not a good way to handle adults. That story is beefed up for you on page 15. Now, let's move on to the Reader's Corner. Students picked to study university courses they did not choose will still have a chance to switch. Kenya Universities and Colleges Central Placement System recently released the university and college selection results for students who sat their KCSE in 2022. You can catch up with that story on page 17. Matters religion. Clerics should remain true to teachings of the Bible. The church has been under siege in recent months. Today, Christianity has lost its appeal and Christians are reviewed negatively in the society. That story is beefed up for you on page 17. Now, let's take a look at business news on the Standard this morning. Banks cement cash cow status with 87.7 billion tax contribution. Report released yesterday shows corporate taxes jumped 77% compared to a year earlier. The amount represents more than a third of the total corporate taxes received by the government. That story is beefed up for you on page 18. KDC gets new chairman in key changes. The Kenya Development Corporation has announced key appointments in the board and management of the company. That story is beefed up for you on page 18. Now, let's shift gears to international news. In Tinubu, Niger coup, a litmus test for democracy in West Africa. Tinubu see military takeover as an affront to his democratic credentials. Niger is the world's 7th largest producer of uranium and has the highest grade uranium ore in Africa. You can catch up with that story on page 22. Also, ex-Ivory Coast president dies, cause unknown. The former president of Ivory Coast, Henry Konan Bedi, has died. He was 89. He took over as the country's second head of state after death of Felix in 1993. You can catch up with that story in on page 22 of the Standard this morning. On page 23, Trump charged with bid to overturn election. Former head of state faces conspiracy to defraud the U.S. tampering with a witness and conspiracy against the rights of citizens. The 77-year-old, who is again running for president, denies wrongdoing. That story is beefed up for you on page 23. Now, for those who love real estate, you have an article here. Global investors scramble for Africa's real estate. You can catch up with that story inside the Standard newspaper this morning. Now, let's move on to sports news. Kenya promoted to Division 1 despite missing World Cup ticket. The team finished runners-up behind Namibia, who bagged the sole ticket to next year's ICC World Cup in Sri Lanka. Coach Irungu says the promotion was a sign that local cricket was getting back to where it belongs. You can catch up with that story on page 37. Also, Kenya Rugby Union plans to identify top talent. Now, the Kenya Rugby Union has begun designing a talent identification program that will enable the union monitor current school games and clubs to flag potential players. That story is beefed up for you on page 37 of the Standard this morning. Also, high school sports. Onjiko Nia ready to leave a mark in Kakamega. After dominating regionals for 2 years, Onjiko believe they can reach East Africa. Nia girls upbeat of good show after qualifying for nationals for the first time in 21 years. That is basketball games right there. Let's take a look at page 39. Kipyegon says she is prepared to handle the pressure at global meeting. Double Olympic champion says she will work with compatriots in medal hunt mission in Budapest. The 1500-meter world champion admits she will be under pressure. You can catch up with that story on page 39. Also, matters football. Xavi confirms Dembele will leave Barcelona for PSG. Barcelona forward Ousmane Dembele will join Paris Saint-Germain, says Barca coach Xavi. The 26-year-old France international was an unused substitute in Barcelona's 1-0 pre-season friendly win over AC Milan in Las Vegas yesterday. That story is beefed up for you on page 39. On the cover page, this is for my fallen soldiers. Glatana lost 3 family members 3 weeks ago. Striker scores a vital goal to send South Africa into the last 16. South Africa reached the last 16 after claiming their first Women's World Cup win, a thrilling 3-2 victory over Italy in Wellington. Let's talk about World Cup. Jamaica enjoy a taste of sweet triumph in Women World Cup. Jamaica qualified for the knockout stages in the Women World Cup for the first time as Brazil went out of the competition in disappointing fashion. You can catch up with that story on page 40, which is the cover page. Let's take a quick break and then we come back with the top stories inside the Daily Nation. Welcome back to the morning momentum. You are still rolling with the host with the most, Alfonsoh. Now, let's take a look at the Daily Nation. Make or break crisis talks. Local and international pressure forced warning parties to negotiate. After their face-to-face meeting, President Ruto and opposition leader Raila Odinga have named their respective negotiators, setting the stage for dialogue brokered by former Nigerian President Olusegun Obasanjo to resolve the post-election crisis that degenerated into blood anti-government protests. But the feuding over agenda for the talks is causing apprehension and straining an uneasy calm occasioned by the temporal ceasefire. That story is beefed up for you on page 4 and page 5. The two sticky issues: soaring commodity prices, opposition lists addressing the problem, their key demand. 2022 poll audit is the second issue. Government rejects scrutiny of election servers, saying the poll is settled. Now, as Ruto confronts high cost of living under pressure from the public to address rising food prices, President announces further reduction of the cost of fertilizer to 2,500 shillings per 50 kilograms of bag. We will catch up with that story on page 4 and page 5. Also, another top story: state bans World Coins operations, jolted by huge crowds submitting for eye scans in exchange for 7,000 shillings despite data privacy concerns. Authorities suspend venture. That story, we'll take a look at it on the cover page. Now, on page 3, Safaricom ordered to pay former call center staff 2.5 million shillings for crippling voice loss. At the Safaricom customer care desk, Eva Katambi spoke to customers for so long that her vocal cords jammed. She lost her voice and her job. Now a court has awarded her 2.5 million Kenya shillings. On page 10, MPs to have final say on education reforms. Members of Parliament will decide the fate of many of the recommended changes to the education system that must be anchored in law. Also on page 8, court suspends permits for loggers as Minister defends lifting of ban. Environment Court bars state from granting licenses to fell trees as Cabinet Secretary is quizzled by MPs. You can catch up with that story on page 8. Now let's delve into the stories inside the Daily Nation this morning. State wants Italians out of Malindi Space Center. Italian government has refused to honor pact on the facility, says Duale. MPs back Kenya's decision to pull out of agreement. You can catch up with that story on page 2. Let's take a look at page 3. Safaricom told to pay former call center staff 2.5 million Kenya shillings for voice loss. Eva Besi Katambi sued Telco for terminating her services after she lost her voice due to vocal cord paralysis. Judge said her injury was related to her job, but rejected her plea to be paid for future medication and special damages. That story is beefed up for you on page 3. Let's move on to page 4. Make or break the crisis talks. Why both Ruto and Raila camps are not for Nusumkate. Even as the Kenya Kwanza and Azimio camps differ sharply on talks agenda, they seem to agree on two things. Number one, the reconstitution of IEBC and not getting into a power-sharing government. Kenya Kwanza Alliance and Azimio la Umoja One Kenya name the individuals who will represent them in the bipartisan talks. That story is beefed up for you on page 4 and page 5 of the standard of the Daily Nation story. Now let's take a look at page 6. Azimio leaders move to court to prevent arrests. A number of politicians have been arrested and charged for participating in protests called by Azimio. Now, High Court judge certifies as urgent politicians application for anticipatory bail. You can catch up with that story on page 6. Let's move to another top story right here. Ruto targets cost of living with fertilizer price drop. Farmers have been urged to go for the cheaper input to increase production. Kenya's poor economic performance is due to gaps in agricultural production, President declares. Now, that story is beefed up for you on page 7. On page 8, Forestry CS defends lifting of logging ban. Ms. Soipan Tuya says logging is being done only in commercial forests. Now, concern MPs worry over environmental degradation. That story is beefed up for you on page 8 of the Standard of the Daily Nation. Now, 5% according to CS, lifting of the logging ban only affects commercial forests, which make up only 5% of country's forest cover. Let's take a look at page 10. MPs to have final say on Ruto education reforms. President has asked Parliament to fast-track any matters relating to the changes. Many of the recommended reforms require changes in laws and regulations. That story is briefed up for you on page 10 of the Daily Nation. Now, Nairobians at risk of getting infections from animals. Close proximity to animals and poor sanitation identified as key risk factors for zoonotic diseases. There are emerging diseases jumping from animals to human beings. You can catch up with that story on page 12 of the Daily Nation this morning. Also, the official launch and reception of chapter Journey Towards Chartering of the Open University of Kenya. You can catch up with that article on page 14 and on page 15 of the Daily Nation this morning. Let's take a look at expert opinion. Now, let's be prepared to tackle cyber attacks and threats. That is a sentiment by Mohammed A. Sheikh. He said, and I quote, "The techniques can detect cyber threats before they occur and prevent them." That story is beefed up for you on page 16. On page 17, why we do politics of poverty, and that is an opinion by Charles Onyango Obo. Now, he said, and I quote, "One of the biggest mistakes we make is to presume that a healthy and wealthy nation is good for the leaders, and therefore it is a goal they should pursue with zeal." You can catch up with that story on page 17. Let's shift gears to some county news. Now, in Bungoma, CRA kicks off bid to draw up fourth revenue sharing plan. In Taita Taveta, paddy fields flourishing as locals embrace rice farming. Also in Trans Nzoia, Swam border post will improve trade. The newly upgraded Swam one-stop border post is expected to ease pressure on the Malaba and Busia customs points and boost trade between Kenya and Uganda. In Uasin Gishu County, Eldoret gets facelift ahead of Devolution Conference. Officials say preparations for the conference are on course. You can catch up with that story on page 19. Let's move on to page 20. CRA kicks off bid to draw up fourth revenue sharing plan. Bungoma County lauded for increasing its own source revenue to 788 million Kenya shillings. You can catch up with that story on page 20. For property lovers again, the DN2 article has featured something here for you. Constructing with plastic blocks. You can catch up with that story on page 21 of the Daily Nation this morning. There are photos here of those plastic block houses. You will catch up with that article inside that on the Daily Nation. Let's take a look at international news. Now, migrants between rock and a hard place in Tunisia. Border guards say they have rescued hundreds of people left by Tunisian authorities over the last 2 weeks. Racist policy migrants abandoned in the hot desert include children and pregnant women. That story is beefed up for you on page 23. On matters business, Watchdog seeks details on electricity meter tender. The public procurement watchdog has written to Kenya Power seeking more information on the 5.4 billion Kenya shillings tender for the supply of meters, which was restricted to local manufacturers and assemblers. Also, another story on business news, Kenya coffee export volume up to 14-year high on yield. Commodity beans fetched 483 billion shillings of 750,543 per ton. State cuts subsidized fertilizer price to 2,500 shillings per bag. You can catch up with that story on page 26. Let's take a look at sports news this morning on the Daily Nation, and we start with golf. Now, golfer Karanga sets the bar high. Kiambu player aims for Kenya Amateur Golf Championship Series over title. Golf now a pro. Golf Timbe, now a pro, holds record of most wins in prestigious tourney. You can catch up with that story on page 32. Also in boxing, 6 Kenyans in semis at Yaounde event. Now, 6 Kenyan boxers are in the medal bracket at the Africa Boxing Confederation Championships being held in Yaounde, Cameroon. But will Yaounde be a renaissance of sorts for the hit squad? You can catch up with that story on page 32. On secondary schools national games, Western region teams under pressure to shine on home soil. Shanderema boys, Butere girls and Madira girls secondary to fly the region's flag in football. Teams to start arriving in Kakamega on Saturday for August 7th to 12th championships. That story is on page 33 of the Daily Nation this morning. Now let's shift to athletics. Kenya's relay teams join the party as Budapest date nears. Now, World Athletic Championships, Budapest readies to host the world from August 19th to August 27th. But Commonwealth Games 10,000 meters bronze medalist Candy is out of the team. You can catch up with that story on page 34. On page 35, South Africa and Jamaica march on as Brazil, Italy fall. Now, this is Women's World Cup. France top Group F after emphatic 6-3 win over Panama. Crushing end to World Cup career of Brazil legend Marta, arguably the greatest player in history of women's football. You can catch up with that story on page 33. Also, greener pastures. Sadio Mane joins Ronaldo at Saudi side Al Nassr. Saudi side Al Nassr confirmed the signing of Bayern Munich striker Sadio Mane, where he will team up with 5-time Ballon d'Or winner Cristiano Ronaldo. You can catch up with that story on page 33. On the cover page, it's all about the eyeball scanning. WorldCoin divides cabinet as Kenyans scramble to register. Concerns have emerged over data privacy as thousands sign up. CSS for Information and Interior yesterday issued contradicting edicts on digital currency. Concerns have emerged over data privacy as thousands of Kenyans line up to sign up. You can catch up with that story on the cover page. Also, lawmakers summon Kindiki Owalo over crypto farm operations. Members of Parliament have summoned Interior Cabinet Secretary Kithure Kindiki and his ICT counterpart Eliud Owalo to explain the ongoing collection of personal data from Kenyans by cryptocurrency project. With that story, we come to an end of today's morning momentum. Thank you so much for choosing to stay with Younib TV. I have been your host, Alfonsoh. Many thanks to those who made this broadcast a success. The Chief Controller, Anifa, Kavira. See you tomorrow morning, same time, same place. Until then, do have a beautiful day. Bye-bye.